I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is Liberalism in Question, a series of podcasts from here at the Centre for Independent Studies, when we examine liberalism, its strengths, its weaknesses, the opportunities and challenges it faces. In other words, we put it under question. And I'm very pleased to say that my guest for this episode is Dr. Jonathan Cole. Jonathan is Director for the Centre of Religion, Ethics and Society at Charles Sturt University. He's got a PhD in political theology, but also a Master's in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. He is Director at the Centre at Charles Sturt University, but at one stage in his life, I see he was a senior terrorism analyst for the Office of National Intelligence, a man of eclectic background. And he's a man who's thinking very deeply about issues concerning classical liberalism, and I believe he's been preparing to write a book on Ludwig von Mises. But we'll talk about that just now. Welcome, Jonathan.
Great to be with you, Rob.
You have been a conservative, but you're now seriously embracing classical liberalism. What has happened?
Well, I underwent an unexpected and rather surprising conversion late last year. I had been a conservative intellectual for I don't know how many years, but quite a while. If you really want to get down in the weeds, I would have described myself as a Kirkian conservative, very much influenced by the thought of Russell Kirk. And I woke up one day after wrestling with the role of the state in society, and realized that I was no longer a conservative. Then started exploring libertarianism and ultimately settled on the classical liberalism of Ludwig von Mises, and would now describe myself as a classical liberal.
I don't know. Can you summarise Kirk's position in a very simple way for me anyway?
Yeah, it's more about his historical role. He wrote a famous and very influential and unlikely bestseller called The Conservative Mind, in I think it was 1953, or at least in the early 50s, and he's really the person in the United States who popularized the term conservatism. He famously originally proposed to the publisher to call the book The Conservative's Route, because he was writing at a time when he thought conservatism was marginalized and despised, and he perhaps unwittingly spawned what is now known as the conservative movement in the US. What he really did was update and popularize the conservative philosophy of Edmund Burke for an American population that was unfamiliar with him. And he really created this new tradition, and sort of Anglo tradition, or if you like, a British American tradition of conservative thought that began with Burke and ran through a whole bunch of figures in both nations, and then he outlined he boiled it down to a bunch of famous principles.
Okay, that's very helpful to get an idea. What is wrong with that? What was it, after many years of holding what seems on the face of it a strong tradition with a great deal of strengths, you've now decided it's inadequate?
Well, to be honest, and this is probably my fault for introducing Russell Kirk, it wasn't so much a falling out with Russell Kirk as two more proximate experiences in my own life that made me re-examine my conservative assumptions. And it wasn't just purely Kirk. I mean, I'd spent years swimming in the waters of conservative intellectual thought, and that was the experience of COVID and really the rise of Donald Trump, but more relevantly, the rise of the populism of what we now call the MAGA movement. The kind of conservatism that I learnt from Russell Kirk was in tension with this kind of right-wing populism. And of course, the experience of COVID, as it did for many people, made me re-examine what I had considered to be a rather benign view of the state that is pretty common in conservatism, that thinks generally the state is a force for good, albeit as long as it's in the hands of conservatives. And really the whole conservative political project is about gaining power so that you can then use what Mises calls the apparatus of coercion and compulsion, that is the state, in order to enact your particular vision of the good life, because I came to the conclusion that conservatives really are all about cultural and moral norms. They're not about pluralism, which means they're not really about individual freedoms. Or you could say that when they talk about individual freedoms, there are limits, provided there is a hegemonic culture and moral tradition that is reflected in the laws of the land and the cultural practices. You see this in its most sharpest expression in the sort of Catholic integralists who essentially want a kind of Catholic theocracy. And so I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but if you want me to boil it down, I realized through the COVID experience that the state was not benign. Actually, it's incredibly powerful. And what I learned from the COVID experience is that for the best of intentions, the state can really suppress very harmfully, in very harmful ways, the individual freedoms that you take for granted on the basis of an error and a miscalculation, because, we now treat COVID like it's the flu, which I thought was always the way we probably should have treated it at the start. And so once I realized that, I started to examine more the state and started to see the myriad ways in which its interventions, not just in the economy, but particularly in the lives of individuals, families, communities, is actually often counterproductive and harmful. And then when I married that with the new trend on the right, which is all about getting control of this apparatus of coercion and compulsion, I realized that pretty much everyone on the right, except for libertarians, are statists, and I could no longer be a statist. It's as simple as that.
Wow. Yes, that's... In fact, there was a critique of liberalism coming from the right, in America especially, people like Patrick Denham, who's claiming liberalism is inadequate, we need something more. And you're saying, no, it's the right thing to have. Tell me about your view of people like Patrick Denham's views.
There are two related but somewhat distinct views one encounters on the right that are popular, particularly with conservatives. One is that liberalism has failed. That's the Patrick Deneen thesis. Indeed, the title of his book was Why Liberalism Has Failed or Failed. I can't remember it exactly. And the other one is to say that liberalism is the source of everything that's wrong in the world from a conservative perspective. I take a very contrary view. I say, look, there are problems. I'm willing to say that liberalism is under threat, under challenge. It's not something that is self-perpetuating. It's like a good marriage. It takes a lot of work to maintain. I just don't think there's any alternative. And so my project is, I would say, we've got to make liberalism work. The only alternative is some form of authoritarianism, whether it's fascism, some form of theocracy, some form of conservative, cultural, legal, political authoritarianism, or I guess you could go the other way and go to anarchy, which is further than I'm willing to go as a classical liberal. I don't go all the way with anarcho-capitalists, but I guess the question I would put to Patrick Deneen and people like Yoram Hazony is what is the alternative to liberalism that preserves individual freedoms, has ample scope for voluntary association, which understands that pluralism is a necessary byproduct of individual freedoms, and which does not engorge the power of the state, because the moment the state becomes really powerful, then that is what politics all becomes about. It's a fight over who controls the institutions, the money, the legislative ability, the policy ability, the foreign relations of this edifice we call the state. And so in that sense, the left and the right, or at least those involved in the political conflict, look no different to the libertarian, or in my case, the classical liberal. They both just want to gain control of the state and use it as the vehicle for implementing their vision of the good life. I want to see the state recede and allow individuals, families, and communities and voluntary associations to populate the main space of our social life together. I'm not saying we should have no government, but the scope of government and the scope and ways in which it encroaches on our lives, or really, let's say, regulates our lives, not just economic, but family, you name it. We are highly regulated individuals, families and communities. And that has been the pattern over the 20th century and into the 21st century. I would like to see that recede. In my view, conservatives, populists on the right, and everyone on the left wants to get control of the state because it's a behemoth, so that they can use it to implement their vision and enforce it on the rest of us.
Let me unpack a little bit what you mean there by classical liberalism. You mean a state that, you don't mean no state, of course, you mean a state. What are the limits, do you believe, the crucial limits that make a state a classical liberal society rather than subtly totalitarian to the left or the right?
Well, classical liberalism, like all political traditions, is a diverse and contested term. I'm particularly influenced by Mises, as you, I think, intimated in the introduction, and I may have...
We should introduce him. He's an Austrian writer in the 1920s and early 30s.
Yeah, Mises is best known as an economist. He was in the so-called third generation of the Austrian economists, a school of economics that goes back to Karl Menger in the late 19th century. Ludwig was born in 1881, so he was a person of the late 19th century, but really started writing in the 1910s, and he became an influential Austrian economist. And he was forced to flee to America during World War II because he was, although he was an agnostic, he was Jewish in terms of his origin, and thus came... In fact, there's a claim that the Gestapo tried to kidnap him while he was working in Switzerland in 1940, I think, or 1939. And then he had a second late career in the US, where he really had a huge impact on the American right, and in particular libertarianism, and he's really embraced by libertarians as one of their grandfather figures. But what people don't know about him as much is that he was a prolific social thinker, and he was a liberal in the 19th century European sense of the term. He wrote a book in 1927 called Liberalism, which was a re-articulation and effort to defend and revive what was often known then as the old liberalism of the 19th century. And as far as I can tell, he considered himself a liberal all the way up until his death in 1973.
What's the key understanding that he had of a liberal society? What was he arguing for?
Well, I have my differences with him. Actually, this is going to sound weird, but it's mainly his methodology that has influenced me. But that's perhaps a bit of an esoteric conversation. But just to outline his liberalism, this is not necessarily my view. He was against. He thought that the sole legitimate role of the state was to secure and protect the physical human being and private property, and on occasion he also said to ensure the smooth operation of free markets. And I think there he was thinking about having mechanisms to deal with fraud and things that would threaten the operation of the market. That's what he thought was the legitimate scope of government. I actually think that's a little too restrictive myself, although he was writing at a different time.
What would you add, Jonathan Cole?
I think you can take classical liberalism in a way that recognizes if you like, common goods, where all those things that classical liberals prize, such as the physical security of individuals, the security of their private property, and their individual autonomy and freedom, can be, put it this way, the only thing that threatens them is not always the actions of other individuals. There are environmental challenges, for example, that require common action. Common action is probably a better term than common good. And so I think you can mount an argument for some limited role of this authority, this minicus conception of government that has mainly a judicial and police function for ensuring, if you like, coordinating some common action problems, potentially even financing them, that cannot be done solely by individuals. anarcho-capitalists would virulently disagree with that. But to go back to Mises for a second, the one interesting thing to put on the table, which if you like indicates just how extreme he was in the view of many people, he was in favor of the complete unregulated flow of people across borders. He thought that people should be free to move wherever they wanted. He thought all communities, right down to the village level, should be free to secede from whatever political entity it was a part of. He had quite a radical vision for the exercise of personal and even communal autonomy, communal being really a form of voluntary association. There's a lot more to it than that. I'm not focusing so much on his economics, where he had a lot of technical arguments that takes us into economic debates, but his vision of liberalism was all about individual freedom, the sanctity of private property, and minimal government, minimal intervention of government.
Jonathan Cole, let me put you the common pushbacks against any form of classical liberalism. One is this: we need the state because we have imbalances of power in a society. We have inequality, which leads to different outcomes, different situations, and some people being unable to protect themselves against others with more power than them. Therefore, we need the hand of a parental state at certain points. What do you say to that argument?
I'd say there are a few problems with that. One, which is identified by Mises, is where do you draw the line? You see, at the moment you think that there's a Rubicon that is easily crossed, and we've crossed it, and I think this is one reason why the scope of governments in so-called liberal polities like Australia keeps expanding, because there's no logical end to the level of intervention to address the problem of inequality or anything related to that. If you think about it, you can intervene to prevent people from harming themselves through drugs, gambling. You can intervene in terms of wages to ensure that everyone gets what you perceive to be a fair wage, although all of these things are subject to change. What someone thinks is a fair wage today might change later. I would simply turn it around and say, where is the logical limit of the intervention of the state if the rationale for its intervention is to fix inequality? You see, Mises's view, which I actually had as a conservative too, this is in Russell Kirk, and it's not a popular view today, is man is not born equal. We're actually born unequal. Unfortunately, that's just a consequence of the reality of existence. Not everyone is born with the same intellectual capacity, with the same physical capacity. Not everyone is born into the same context that offers, or environment that offers, the same opportunity. If you're not gifted with the genes that some people have, and you're unfortunate enough to be born in a poor suburb, in a broken household with substance abuse and rampant crime, we don't start life equally. So the problem is, it's not that nothing should be done about that, but there is no logical end to the efforts the state could do to equalize. And the state actually just does piecemeal things, which is why politicians constantly come up with new ideas for new interventions, because there's a long way down this road of intervening to the point then where we do actually live in a totalitarian system. And the one other thing I would say is that, in my view, the more the state takes on, the more individuals feel absolved from lifting their own hands to do anything to help people. So that when most people walk past the beggar in the street, they think, well, there's Centrelink, there's welfare, there's all kinds of charities. And I'm sure if you talk to most Australians, they would say, well, that's the state's problem, and I support this activity indirectly through my taxes. So I've done my bit, so therefore I can walk past the beggar in the street and my conscience is clean because it's not my problem. If the state weren't taking care of all this, I actually think we'd all be forced, perhaps shamed, into doing a lot more for each other.
But this is not actually, Jonathan Cole, one reason why liberalism is contested and on the way, because people would prefer to live in a paternalist state rather than take the kind of bracing responsibilities that you're proposing. In other words, we feel comfortable having the state look after us, as long as it doesn't do things we don't like. Don't you think that's one reason why liberalism has waned in its support?
Well, I guess the question is, and this is really a question worth asking, do we actually live in a liberal state? We certainly don't live in a liberal state as defined by Mises. We're a long way from there. I know we categorize the state. I think liberalism is a useful categorical term insofar as it goes, in that just as a high level term that distinguishes, when you say Australia is a liberal state, it tells you it's not a socialist state, although I guess some people would debate that. But in reality, it's a mixed state, or actually, here's the interesting thing. Mises worked with three categories. One was liberalism, one was capitalism, one was socialism, and then what he called interventionism. He would describe Australia as an interventionist state, not a capitalist state. And there's an interesting argument you can find in some anarcho-capitalists, interesting because it forces you to view a society like Australia in a new way. They say we're living in a pre-capitalist state. Now, given their particular vision, where there is literally no state and everything is handled by voluntary association and in practice, private enterprise, then we've never really tried capitalism in the way they suggest. I think they're wrong about exactly what would happen in that situation. But I actually think we have a problem in our language, and this is one of my criticisms of the Patrick Deneen's and Yoram Hazony's and Adrian Vermeule's of the world, whose thesis is that liberalism has failed, because I am looking for this liberalism and I can see aspects of it, and at a very simplistic level, if we want to distinguish from, say, fascism or theocracy, then I can accept Australia is a liberal state. But if you look at the classical liberal tradition, Australia is not and has never really been a classical liberal state. We're an interventionist state.
But one of the criticisms of liberalism is that it doesn't do enough. It's too thin. It doesn't provide a complete, thick worldview, and therefore that was one of Deneen's complaints about it. It encourages, and many complaints, is that liberalism is frankly not strong enough, not deep enough. That's why we need to have values. We need to have liberalism doesn't decide what is the good life. It lets people decide, and this leads to a society which is suboptimal.
Yeah, it does. And then you've got to ask yourself, and why is the political temperature so hot in the US? It's because people in different political tribes feel like they're ruled by a tyrannical regime in Washington, or those who are in institutional power feel like they're threatened by barbarians at the gates, otherwise known as their fellow citizens. You see, I think the problem is that I think a lot of the critique of liberalism you get on the right is conceptual and philosophical. And then the mistake they make is to assume that that is the actual polity and culture they're living in. I just don't see it. Contemporary America does not match anything in libertarianism or classical liberalism. If you look at except in a very superficial way, it's a highly regulated society after all. And I think part of the problem is that, yeah, it's liberal compared to other polities. So it's certainly more liberal than, say, some European states like the Scandinavian states. It's, of course, way more liberal than China, Iran, North Korea. It goes without saying. But there's this huge gap between the vision of someone like Mises or even a Friedrich Hayek. There's an almighty gap between people like Murray Rothbard and what passes for liberalism in the US. And so I think there's a discord and a mismatch between the conceptual critique of liberalism, which I'm willing to take a lot more seriously, and that's an interesting debate to have. But then the idea that you get in the Deneen's of the world is that this putative liberal polity that exists in the US allowed for a kind of neo-Marxist takeover right down to the boardrooms. I just think that fails empirically. I just think that's a misdiagnosis of what is actually going on in the US. And of course, I don't find attractive their alternative, which is kind of all innuendo and hints, but has to logically be some form of authoritarianism, because the moment you accept this putative liberal state on their analysis, it will eventually sow the seeds of its own destruction. So I can only assume the conservative alternative is some post-liberal order, which by logical definition has to curb freedoms so that the dumb citizens don't become Marxists or whatever it is that is going to undo the state. I have a lot more faith in the robustness of voluntary association, actually.
As I understand your case is, you may want to critique liberalism, but it's still a lot better than any of the alternatives. It's not perfect, but it's better than any of the alternatives.
My case is this: we are told liberalism has failed, yet we have never implemented a classical liberal vision of the kind to which I belong. So the kind of political vision I have doesn't exist right now. I'm not defending the existing regime because I live in an interventionist state on Misesian grounds. And so you're telling me something that has not actually been tried properly yet has failed. And then the second thing is I simply say, what is the alternative? My case is not that classical liberalism, a kind of, minimal state that maximizes individual freedom and voluntary associations, perfect, because I don't believe human beings are perfect. And so I think one outcome is going to be shallowness, drugs, sex, whatever. But a liberal polity will also allow people to pursue the great existential questions of their lives. I think religion will prosper because right now, this, Rob, you're not free to just operate a religion. You're subject to myriad regulations and government oversight. And, we saw during COVID that the government has the power to say you can't sing, which looking back just seems like a completely ridiculous thing to prevent human beings from doing. So I simply say, what's the alternative? Because if you're going to critique it, that's fine. But you then either have to accept it as a lesser of however many evils, and I can respect that position, or you have to offer an alternative. And I'm going to tell you right now that alternative is going to be authoritarian if we follow it to its logical conclusion. You may not believe that at the time, but I'm confident I can convince you that ultimately, once we tease out your alternative to the liberal order, that's where it's going to go. And secondly, we certainly shouldn't idealize liberalism. I just think it's on whole better if people have more autonomy over their personal lives. And I will say this, and that's because, put it this way, excuse me, this granted is a weakness of libertarianism, but if you want a minimal state, then you need stronger families, stronger civil society, more and stronger associations. You need a greater role for religious institutions, worship and practice, in my view, not because you're going to force people to be religious believers, but all of these institutions are actually going to take on more responsibility. And I actually think individual citizens, and what does citizenship mean now? We're all infantilized, I think, and we all take our cues from the government. I actually think people will be forced to mature and grow up and take more personal responsibility. Now, some people will live selfish lives, but I look around and I see people living selfish lives now. So I'm not sure we get many more greater ills than exist. And so I could go on, but that's probably enough pontificating on my hobby horse.
Can I go back to your past? And this is my last area of questioning. You were involved in looking at terrorist organisations and threats to serious threats. What should a society do to protect itself against deeply illiberal forces that use liberalism's freedom to undermine and attack the very society that's given the freedom to act?
Yeah, I mean, on the terrorism thing, well, that's one of the legitimate functions that Mises and I would say the state has, because terrorism is a threat to the life and property of individuals. It's also very harmful to social cohesion. And social cohesion is one of those, when I was trying to fumble my way to an articulation of where I could see potentially a role for the state, and that Mises might not. I think the security threat could go to something like social cohesion. That could encompass antisocial behaviour that could threaten social cooperation, because it's through social cooperation that individuals thrive and are able to pursue their ends. So I don't have a problem with counter-terrorism. Now, are there things intelligence services do that do not meet the kind of limited criteria for what a government should do? Yes, I think there are, if you like, intelligence targets that are a complete waste of resources and just are not directly related to the protection of individual lives.
What about ideas? If I'm producing Nazi or fascist or Islamic fascist ideas and preaching them, should that be allowed in a liberal society? In other words, I'm calling for the overthrow of the very society I'm in. I'm not doing it yet, I'm just preaching it, right?
Yeah, well, I don't have a problem with people preaching whatever they want. If they think they can find an audience and they are willing to obey the laws of the liberal society, which means they do not use coercion, they respect the property rights of individuals, and they do not aggress against individuals. That includes inciting violence. I would allow that. And the reason I would allow it is that I actually think the risk of those kind of ideas garnering a wide audience is limited. And do you know why I think that? Because often when we think about these issues, we forget to think through the consistent logic of what a free society would mean. So if you want to start the Church of Adolf Hitler, you know what's going to happen? You're going to be on the front page of the newspaper with a photo of your face, an angry mob of people all over social media and the news condemning you. You're probably going to face protests, and all that's perfectly fine in my view. I mean, the right to free speech also comes with an obligation to hear criticism. The alternative, again, is that we have ASIO listening to your phones and monitoring you. We find violations of laws to charge you with, and we put you in jail merely for preaching, because I've already said that, you know, if you actually break the law or planning an attack, then fine, get arrested and go to jail. So I think a lot of the support for interventionism is based on fear, quite frankly. And again, I'm not saying that somehow we all just magically transform into a new kind of human being if we have these greater freedoms. I just think we have far too little faith in our ability as cooperative human beings, even out of self-interest, to police ourselves socially and culturally.
Which means that to live in a liberal society, I must be content to live in a society with people who have viewpoints I find deeply wrong, and that's okay. Not that they're wrong, it's okay, but I've got to live with them. There's no way in which I can avoid the inevitable pluralism that will come about by human freedom. That's got to be the case. That's it.
And it's precisely the society we live in now. We do not live in the world where people are protected from every view that they potentially find offensive, and there are political forces that want to restrict speech and other activity in order to protect people's supposed emotional well-being and the life. But don't forget, Rob, the thing that we always forget, you don't just have to put up with it. You can fight it if you want. The very same freedom that allows the views you don't like. You can organize, you can write, you can propagandize, you can convert, you can build support, you can lobby, you can draw attention to, you can expose, you can reveal, you can argue against. And people do this in society right now. I mean, we have a high degree of freedom when it comes to speech, but there are many forces now, and predominantly on the left, but I also find them on the right, because I've met conservatives who say Marxism should be illegal at universities. Like if I were running higher education, we wouldn't be free to teach that, which I just find deeply illiberal. And then on the left, of course, we're policing everything right down to pronouns, which I just find ludicrous.
I guess your vision is of a state in which people don't run to the state to protect them from harm. They take responsibility themselves, either them as individuals or in the communities that they live in. You are writing a book in your long sabbatical on von Mises, and I hope it comes out and it'll cause a lot of very interesting reading, I think, to revive his thinking, which has been a bit lost, particularly his social thinking, which is, I must say, until I talked to you, I had not realised he had anything to say in that area. Jonathan Cole, Dr. Jonathan Cole, thank you so much for your contribution here to Liberalism in Question. Thank you for joining us.